And we're live. Awesome. Welcome to RaC Guild number 9. Thank you. I was just talking to Alfred. Cannot believe we've been doing this for 9 months already. It's like the baby needs to be birthed now. So this is March 2025, and RaC Guild is really pleased this evening to have a presentation from the lovely Phillipa Martin from Salsa Digital, who were the partners in the Regulation as Code project that the Cardano community funded that got this all started over 9 months ago. Actually, we started in 2022, I think it was, in Fund 8. And the Cardano community supported the start of that project, some upskilling for Salsa Digital, and the space has expanded ever since. So it would be wonderful this evening to hear about the update from Salsa Digital, where you guys are at now, and all the exciting news about your proof of concepts and everything else that's been going on. So without further ado, we'll have time for questions afterwards. Phillipa, over to you.
Thanks, Jo. So today I'm actually going to focus on to rules as code or not to rules as code. That is the question. So first of all, just a quick little bit of an introduction about me. I'm currently working at Salsa Digital as the Rules as Code practice lead, although I have worked at Salsa for quite some time in another role, but I'll tell you about that in a second. And I'm primarily working as a business analyst since January 2022. And in a weird way, this makes me both a newbie to the field, 3 years on, but also highly experienced, because although Rules as Code has been around for a while, it's still a smaller emerging field. And there aren't actually many people dedicated to working in this space around the world. And before Rules as Code, I have a 25 years of experience in content and user journeys, and that goes across print way back when, and then not for very long before I specialised in online content. And my content experience is across corporate, government, print online, and even crime fiction, so quite broad. In terms of what we're going to do today, we're going to start off by looking at a bit of context. I really want to do that just to sort of show where I'm coming from and what informs my understanding of what is good as rules as code and what is bad use cases for rules as code, and then go on to a bit of a rules as code checklist. So first of all, the context. So one of the things that affects my views on rules as code is obviously the projects I've worked on. So the first one is Benefit Me, which was working on codifying the New Zealand Social Security Act. Now, this is actually the one that Jo just mentioned. So that project was a collaborative project led by Rules as Code trailblazers like Pia Andrews, Hamish Fraser, Marco Carago, and of course, not to mention the RaC Guild's very own Jo. And then our next cab off the rank was also in 2022. We completed a COVID vaccination Rules as Code proof of concept for Australia's whole of government content management system and web hosting platform called GovCMS. GovCMS is owned by Australia's Department of Finance and has some very strong advocates within the program. They wanted to bring rules as code to the Australian public and also Australian citizens, which led to the next project, which was the GovCMS Rules as Code Sandpit project. This has now been going for about 15 months, and we're at 12 proof of concepts and counting for government here in Australia. So 12 different government agencies, 12 different use cases. So as I mentioned, all of that very much informs my take on what makes good rules as code use cases. Another thing that it informs it for me is our tech stack. So all of these projects were delivered using OpenFisca, which I think everybody here knows, but I'll just briefly mention that OpenFisca is a Python-based rules engine. It was developed in 2011 by the French government to codify its social security benefits. And we couple that with Drupal, which is an enterprise-grade content management system. One of the important things about both of these elements in our tech stack is that they're both open source, which is really important to Salsa. We've been involved in the open source movement for a while, and also it's important to our largely government clients. Now, I would like to note that while this is our current tech stack, we are wanting to experiment and do a proof of concept with blocks. It is on my long back list of to-do items, but I will get to it eventually. In addition to our experience in rules as code and the tech stack, there are a couple of other things that kind of come into play for Salsa and for me with this question of, what are good rules as code use cases. The first one is that many of Salsa's clients are government clients. And within that, we're often trying to invest in scalable platforms across whole of government rather than duplication. So traditionally, there was often a lot of sort of siloed building in the tech space with different government departments building their own website, their own other technological platforms. And GovCMS is a great example of a whole of government solution. And with rules as code on the GovCMS platform, that's going to be an excellent example of a whole of government rules as code solution. And the fourth and final context for what informs this opinion is actually Salsa's desire to help governments be more open, more connected, and more consolidated. So rules as code can help government be more open by giving citizens easier access to the rules, and this helps with transparency as well. Rules as code can help governments connect better with citizens. Instead of citizens having to sift through pages and pages of content, or worse still even, many different complex legislation, they can interact with a code of rules and perform tasks like eligibility checking or compliance checking. And finally, more consolidated. Codifying rules, especially using a whole of government approach, it can consolidate the citizen experience and create more unified services. So obviously in this rules as code context, we're talking about unified rules as code services. So I know there's quite a lot, but I think as I go through, you're going to see how all of what I just mentioned comes into play. So let's dive into some good rules as code use cases. So the first one is eligibility. So eligibility is a good fit. If I think about our experience to date, I'd say maybe 75, 80% of our use cases have actually focused on eligibility. And things like when I'm talking about non-calculations, so without calculations, it might be things like eligibility for passports or citizenship or for a particular program or job or a visa eligibility, etc. Any of those sorts of eligibility items can be done well with rules as code. And even in other industries like finance or insurance, you can do, a loan or insurance eligibility checker. In these cases, people are filling out information about themselves or their situation, and then they get the result as to whether they're eligible or not. Then we've also got the eligibility coupled with calculations. So a good example of that is, of course, the social security benefits. So people go through, they provide some information, and they're told if they're eligible for a particular payment, and if they are, how much they should get. And again, that could easily be translated into other industries. The one I gave before of finance and insurance, it could be like insurance payouts or other areas where you're kind of wanting to do some calculations. And this one is one that's definitely informed by our tech stack. So it's sort of coming back to that tech stack, because OpenFisca, not surprisingly, given it was designed for social security benefits, is really, really good at calculations. And they can be, more simple ones, like we've got one use case where we wanted to be able to tell the date, a person's age exactly on the day their course starts. But the date of birth was used for other things. So we got them to put in their date of birth as well as their course start date. And then OpenFisca works out how old they'll be exactly on that course start date. So that's eligibility. Next one is compliance, another excellent use case for rules as code. It can cover things like, for local council perhaps, does this building plan meet local council requirements? Or keeping on the building example, does it meet building regulations? Or does the manufacturing plant meet safety standards from whatever regulatory body might be involved. And again, in this case, people will be talking about their situation, answering questions, and then they'll be told if they're compliant or not, or perhaps if they need to comply. So in lots of examples, it might be, do I need to comply with this regulation? Next one is classification. So this could be medical classifications, building classifications, security classifications. The user can answer questions, and then at the end they're told, right, your items, so your building is classified as XYZ, your security for this IT platform is classified as high risk, you need the highest security features possible, etc. Thinking more generally, for rules as code, black and white, yes, no scenarios are definitely easier to code. Having said that, we have experimented with some of these areas of subjectivity. As an example, we might have a page or a results page for you're eligible, a results page for you're not eligible, and then we might also have a maybe results page. So perhaps a person has met 90% of the criteria, but there's one area or two areas where the information they've provided, there's a bit of leeway given their situation, and it does need that specialist to review it. So in those cases, we can say, look, from what you've told us, it looks like you're eligible, but because you said this, your application will need to be reviewed by a specialist before we can give you a definite answer. So you can work with a little bit of the greys. And one of the most powerful uses for rules as code is constructing policy twins. Now, in an ideal world, the policy twin would be created at the same time as you're drafting and creating the legislation. And think of it as digital twins, like where you have a twin of a city, and they're used to help with infrastructure planning or public transport or urban planning. Whereas if you have a digital policy twin, not only can citizens interact with the rules and use that twin to find out if they're eligible or compliant, etc., but it can also be used by policymakers to model changes. So what will happen if we change one of the rules? So maybe, talked about the Social Security, maybe it's the age pension. What will happen if we change the age pension age, if we make it higher or lower? And using, and this is again, OpenFisca does this simulations, you can actually model policy changes. So that makes legislation a great candidate for a digital twin, and therefore a good candidate also for rules as code. Another reason why you might choose rules as code, so these aren't really use cases, but more coming back to some of that higher level strategic thinking. This comes back to that whole of government approach or the bigger picture. So you might have a department that's got a small piece of legislation, and they can maybe code that quite easily using a web form and conditional logic or something. But then their neighbours also have to, the team within their department, another team within the department has to code the next section of the legislation. Another team within that department has to code another section of the legislation. So this would be a very siloed approach, whereas you can use rules as code to give that much better whole of government consolidated platform. Another reason why you might choose rules as code is if you want one rules engine and many interfaces. So in the case of OpenFisca, you get a OpenFisca rules engine API. And in that, say, the government context, that means that you could have a public website where the citizens go. Let's go back to the Social Security. Perhaps they're finding out if they're eligible for something and how much they should get. And then you have the public servants can be using a different interface, but it's still using the same API, which means they're drawing on the same rules and doing the same calculations. And this is really important because it helps with consistency and transparency. Another one is easier rules management, including historical, current and future rules. So again, this is very much embedded from the context of OpenFisca for us. So rules as code in general can help with code management. But if we look at OpenFisca, you have the ability to store historical rules, the current rules, as well as future rules. So let's go back to that age pension example. You can actually store if it changed from 65 to 64 and then it changes to 67, you can have all of those rules actually stored in there. which is really, really important because it gives you traceability and you always access point-in-time rules. Finally, another reason you might choose rules as code is going back to this policy twin idea, and so you want to do policy modelling. As I mentioned before, OpenFisca does actually include simulations, so you can experiment with changes and see the effects. This really helps with identifying intended and unintended consequences of policy changes. So that's a few use cases and reasons that we find good for using rules as code. So, you know, back to rules as code or not to rules as code, that's why to rules as code. But I thought it might be interesting to see, well, what are other people saying in this space as well? So in 2020, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development released a comprehensive paper called Cracking the Code. And I've got a quote up there. The bolding is my own though, so I'll just read that out. Rules as code approaches appear to lend themselves to rules possessing certain characteristics. These include that they are more prescriptive, repeatable, and valuable if codified. It goes on to talk a little bit about valuable, meaning that they're used repeatedly or have a significant impact for businesses and people. And that's from page 19. Then later on, there's a whole section on what makes a good rules as code use case. It says prescriptive rules leave little ambiguity about the course of action that must be taken. The prescriptive criterion naturally lends itself to certain types of rules, such as those relating to eligibility and calculation. Such rules are also conducive to the development of if-then statements. And rules that would be valuable if codified, these are rules that are likely to offer significant social or commercial benefit, for example, in their capacity to better enable economic activity or reduce business compliant costs. They are also likely to be used repeatedly and by multiple parties. And the final thing from that report that I wanted to reference here, the actual original source of this is the New South Wales government, so close to home for us. And they have created this really simple decision tree. The first question is, do you have rules? Now, we'd hope that if they're looking at rules as code, they have some rules, but you know, best to make that clear. And then, are they prescriptive? So again, we're getting this idea of prescriptive, black and white, yes, no. And would it help to automate them? Okay. So what are some bad rules as code use cases? When does rules as code not really work? First one is rules and processes that require lots of subjective decisions or that are entirely subjective. So we've already kind of covered how objective is better, because obviously if you need a person to be making a decision, that's not a good use case for automation and for rules as code. Frequently changing internal workflows or highly contextual business logic with limited reuse potential. So rules as code is best if it's sort of stable and well-defined business logic that really benefits from transparency and consistency and reusability. But if you've got something that's changing a lot, or it's highly specialized, or you've got a limited audience, in those cases, simpler automation workflow tools are probably going to be a better bet for you. Another one is scenarios where the rule execution requires extensive real-time lookups against large, frequently changing reference database. This is because rules as code frameworks are optimized for computational logic rather than data processing, and they don't have those database optimization features that make those lookup processes efficient. And this means that, you know, they're not ideal. You might have performance issues, so not ideal for rules as code either. Certainly our example of an OpenFisca use case. Finally, in some cases, you're just talking about scenarios that can be executed faster and more easily with other technical solutions. So if you don't have, the example I gave before when it was a small piece of legislation, but maybe that was a small piece and they needed to codify the whole thing, that would be an example of something that might be easier to do from a different type of technical solution, but you have to consider other factors like this whole of government approach. But if that's not there, then obviously it makes more sense to do a simpler, something that's not using OpenFisca. So that leads us to our rules as code criteria, a bit of a checklist. Obviously, most of this checklist relates back to the ones that I said at the start were good use cases. Now, you don't need to check all of these items, but for example, prescriptive and mostly objective black and white rules. So we've heard that a little bit, both in our examples that we've given and that we've seen from doing the rules as code work, and particularly the last 12 proofs of concept, but also that was also mentioned in the OECD report and by the New South Wales government. So I think that's a clear message that that's a better bet. And then things like eligibility, compliance, and classification. These generally, you know, unless there's a lot of subjectivity involved, these generally lend themselves quite well to rules as code implementations. With calculations, so again, thinking back of our context of OpenFisca, a use case that uses calculations, perhaps coupled with eligibility or with compliance or classification, can be a really good use case for rules as code. Also simulation and modelling. We talked about the policy twin and how OpenFisca has the simulation capacity. So obviously if it's that sort of use case, then rules as code is a really good fit. And finally, if you are looking for that whole of government or cross-jurisdictional solution, rules as code is also a good fit for those. So I open it up for discussion and questions to rules as code or not to rules as code. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Philippa. Awesome. Very, very cool run through. I don't know if anybody else has got any questions to start off or whether you're just thinking, but I've got a couple. If nobody else has got their hand up, then I will jump in. So in your use cases, your proof of concepts that you've been doing, the 12 with the different Australian government departments, have you had the opportunity to do any simulation work with any of them yet to use those those features of OpenFisca?
So far, we personally have not done simulation through the Sandpit program, the GovCMS Sandpit program. However, one of the clients, once we built the digital twin, and they also upskilled their internal developers, so their internal developers did a lot of the coding as well, and then they did their own simulations using that digital policy twin, which was great. We got to demo it to a larger group of stakeholders, and we kind of demoed our part and they demoed the simulations, and yeah, it was great to see.
Wonderful. So that partnership is working for you. Sorry, go, Con.
Just to add a little bit to what Philippa said, what was interesting there is they sort of joined the loop in that their idea was that if they capture the data in this structured form, then they're able to run that. They have the data, the simulation data, to be able to then run, down the track. They could run that through their model and do their change scenario analysis if they just change this based on real life data that they've received already through the system. So they're able to sort of use both rules as code in the immediate sense to serve a particular purpose around eligibility or something, but then they're able to gather that data and use it in a simulation context. So that was pretty cool as well.
Awesome. Very, very cool. And that's that work with OpenFisca has progressed into a more solid partnership between Salsa and OpenFisca. Con, while you're there, what's the news?
Yeah, well, we've got an OpenFisca association now. So to date, OpenFisca has been an open source project, as I think Philippa may have mentioned, out of the French government a little while ago, and now they've formed an entity called the OpenFisca Association. They've got 20 founding members who voted for a board, a 5-member board, and an executive director, and again trying to promote OpenFisca, the project, and just get it adopted more globally by around the world. And I happen to be one of those from the Service Provider College to be voted onto the board. So yes, I'm on the board of OpenFisca Association, and while we're at it, 19th of March, there'll be an official launch of the OpenFisca Association, and it'll be in Paris, both in person and online. And I think there'll be more to come from that, more announcements to come on that side. But that promises to be very, very exciting. They've got speakers from various countries, and they've also got the OECD speaking there as the keynote. So a person from the OECD. So yeah, it's all happening on the OpenFisca side.
It's awesome. That's fantastic news. Thank you. I'm glad I asked. So, any other questions, or should I ask another one? Jason? Jaden? Go for it, Jaden.
Not so familiar with the other work that you've done outside of the Sandpit program, Phillipa. Jaden Paragon, Australian Department of Finance. I wanted to ask if you guys have done any small scale or proof of concept work with the reusability of rules as code. So have you had a rule set and then experimented with using, I guess, two user interfaces? You could, with one example, we had like the multiple web forms on the one site, but have you experimented with the same rules flowing to different sites, Drupal or whatever else?
We actually have, Jade, and I'll have to show you because it's the GovCMS original COVID vaccination proof of concept. So we built two front ends, one that was like a simulation of a more generic rules, and the other one that was very specific as an Indigenous experience. So we built two different front ends. There was only one added question, which was obviously, are you of Indigenous background? And so, yeah, we did use the same rules, the same OpenFisca driving those two interfaces. And they're still up and live, I believe, so I can get you the details in the Shield, given you're in GovCMS.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah. The original GovCMS proof of concept.
Awesome.
And that one actually also demonstrated how you could combine jurisdictions as well, because we had two use cases. One was, am I up to date with my vaccinations? And the other one was, do I need to be vaccinated to work in my job? So the am I up to date with my vaccinations was the federal one. And as you may remember, if we have to cast our minds back to those lovely COVID years, here in Australia, at least, there was different rules in different states. So depending on what state you were in, there were different rules in terms of whether you had to be vaccinated in certain jobs. And so we also demonstrated this idea of crossing the jurisdictions and being able to have the one rule set for state and federal sitting in the one spot so that people can access it across jurisdictions as a seamless citizen experience.
Fun fact, Jaden, during that multi-channel single rule set, I was pushing really, really hard to do a third channel, which was a voice bot, but it was a whole lot of extra work, and I got outvoted based on lack of funds because we had already invested. But it was it would have been so cool.
I agree.
Yeah.
So are all 12 proof of concepts done and up, or are you sort of halfway through, or where is that?
So we've done 12. We've got more in the works actually. Another one is underway at the moment in the Drupal build, and then we've got another one that we've just done the kickoff for, and we're about to start discovery not next week but the week after. But they're all I guess you're kind of commercial in confidence, and they're behind shields and stuff. So unfortunately, we can't show them all and let everybody play with them and all those fun things.
Okay, so it's still it's Sandpit, obviously, and it's called proof of concept Sandpit. So this has been testing it out with the public servants of various different parts of the Australian government, and how. What's their reaction to it? I mean, you've got 12 and another one on the go, so I assume it's good, but the word is getting out there.
The word is definitely getting out there. We've had a lot of interest, and some agencies are interested, not so much for a Sandpit, but they're just keen to stay in touch for production when we have it on the platform. So yeah, this is what our our leader, Sharon Clarkson at GovCMS, has been wanting for a while, where you let government kind of test the technology, see if it's working for them, and then they can either develop that in-house or they can have it on our platform when we get to it. So yeah, no, it's been really cool being part of that journey.
Excellent. That's so exciting, leading the way.
And I was just going to add, I think most of the people have been thrilled with their,
Yes.
even though we've had to reduce scope, we, have, for most of them, we haven't been able to do, massive things because they are small proof of concepts. Even with those sort of smaller scope of the rules, people have been really happy and really impressed, and they like the process and they like the final output as well. So that's been good. I see Jason's had his hand raised for a while.
Yeah, actually, that leads directly into the question I was going to ask, Phillipa, is when you're dealing with people in these departments, and because you do have to start small, and as you're mentioning, the smaller the use case, maybe the less efficient the return on the effort involved. So I was just wondering, like, what kinds of reactions are you getting from the developers and people in these departments in terms of, do they anticipate that this would be, that doing the rules as code way would be faster? Or does it seem like a lot of work to them right now?
I think it's a combination. I think that they see that it's going to take some time, but they can also see that then it will be faster, if you know what I mean. So the initial, and this is the thing with rules as code. I think, everyone on this call's unfortunately well aware of that it is time consuming at the moment, particularly doing all that manual review of the legislation and getting it into code. So it is quite a bit of effort, but at the same time, then down the track comes the reward. And I don't know, Jason, if you saw in one of these guilds, we had, I think it was Tim D'Souza, and he had done an analysis on the cost benefit analysis. And he had worked out that for every $1 spent on rules as code, you'd get I think it was a $2.51 return. So I can't remember exactly how he worked that out, but there is information about how he did it. So if you haven't seen that link, I can shoot it through to you. But I think it's that thing of, it is a lot of work up front, but then it pays the dividends later on. And I think they've all realized that.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed in the work that we did in the Government of Canada with this is that sometimes people kind of saw unexpected benefits from going through the encoding process. Have you had that experience with the Sandpit?
Yeah, definitely. We've had two experiences where there was basically an error was found during the codifying process, when even the subject matter experts were kind of like, oh gosh, how do we not notice this? But once it came time to code it, it was like, one of them was where there was supposed to be different sort of classifications. It was an eligibility one, but there was supposed to be different classifications, and there was sort of 5 different streams, and one of the streams was actually the same question, the same level of classification, and it had never been sort of picked up before. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that we found too. And I mean, when we were doing it, we were looking less at automation tasks and more at drafting tasks specifically. But it was exactly that kind of thing where people found that even if it is time consuming, the being forced to think harder about them made them think better.
Yeah,
I think it might have been the same case that Phillipa is talking about, but I remember the subject matter experts, they stepped back and they were like, hang on, we aren't delivering policy that way. And when they actually went through the legislation, they realized that they were delivering a service that didn't exactly align with the legislation. And that was revealed because we went through that encoding process. So it was very cool seeing that, like, hang on, this is how we've always done it. We refer to our website, but the website is not true to the legislation. And the rules as code, we're going off the legislation.
That brings me to a question, which is from the citizen's perspective, right? So, well, 2 questions really. So the first one is, out of those proof of concepts, has there been any, you know, like real user experience testing with citizens? Have you, you know, even in small groups, because I understand that it's all shielded and everything, right? But literally trying out, is this experience better for you at the other end? We did it with the Citizens Advice project right at the very beginning, and had some awesome response from the Citizens Advice Bureau advocates at the beginning. So yeah, interested to know whether you've been able to do any of that, Jaden.
Not so much yet, because it's been mainly for the kind of tech teams in the different departments for them to get a handle of what rules as code is and really get, you know, see tangibly what it is, not just have it described to them. But I think that's definitely something that would be interesting if we want that wider adoption, just being able to show that benefit to the end user, definitely.
Well, and to the public servants and the people holding the purse strings, right?
Yeah, to show that, you know, that this is better for an end user. It's going to save them time. That's certainly a good business case.
Yeah, and then my question the other way was, have you got further up the stack into the drafting area, as Jason was kind of inferring, like actually thinking about drafting the rules as code right at the very beginning?
We've talked about this, and that is a really good point, because, you know, we solve so many problems by going upstream, and then getting there, there's some political things, and also the fact that we're on, we host like a CMS at the end of the day. But yeah, no, we're definitely looking to engage some of the people that are up at the big house and writing that legislation. So yeah.
Yeah, we have been trying to push, you know, and we certainly mention it. And if there is, I think we've had one potential sandpit where it might play that way. And that was sort of very much through us saying, you know, it's also great for, you know, creation of policy and for drafting, co-drafting the digital twin at the same time as the legislation. And we're yet to know if that particular, so that's a sandpit that might be in a future one, but we don't know yet if that's going to come through or not. So we'll wait and see.
Could I just chip in to say, I'm from a legislative drafting office. I work with the Commonwealth of Nations Association of Legislative Council. So, and I'm very, very keen to have drafting offices introduced to this. So if you do want to take that forward, please do get in touch with me.
Thank you.
That's a yes right now.
Yeah, we're very keen to implement that drafting. So yeah, we'll definitely. So where are you based? In
Jersey. Yeah, Channel Island. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, we can reach out offline and have a better discussion about that.
I think Jason's also got, you've also got experience in the same area in Canada, right? I think you were saying with your alternative technology. So yeah, there are a couple of options.
We actually just had Marty Perron who presented at RaC Guild. I don't know if it was the last time or the time before. Some work that he did with Anna Logie, who is in the legislative drafting department in Justice Canada. They published an article in Loophole, which is the Commonwealth Association of Legislative Council newsletter. It was the December 24 edition of Loophole. So if you check that out, they've got a big long paper in there about some work that they did on Navigable Waters Act encodings, and they were looking at regulations or something like that. But yeah, they have been doing some cool stuff on the drafting side.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a place where we want to get even the examples that Jaden and I were talking about from our sandpits, from our proof of concepts. You know, there's been two, as I said, where they've discovered sort of things that are like, oh, that's not quite right. And if that had been done while you're drafting it, they're discovered while you're drafting it instead of in retrospect, instead of having, you know, people implement legislation not quite correctly, or even, you know, even that there's that element of looking at the written word, and two people can have two different interpretations of the same clause in a piece of legislation. So yeah, I think it's another area where rules as code it's an area we're definitely interested in, and obviously it's a very powerful area to get in at that start.
If I could just say, going back to the point about the feedback we got from the agencies, one of the telling things was there are a number of, or a couple of the agencies that wanted and organised for their higher level executives to watch the showcase. And so they were so keen on it that they wanted the decision makers up the tree to see the showcase and buy in, and so that's all part of it. And now the issue, the sort of thing that's stalling things a little bit, not stalling, but the next step is to have the production version of the rules engine available so that they can take it the next step. There's a number of, if not most of those sandpits would probably go live on production if they had the choice. But yeah, that's still a work in progress that we're working with finance on.
And actually, Joe, I wanted to go back to your user research question as well. Just that wasn't in scope for this particular. In fact, for obviously, as you know, we did do it in the first project we worked on, which was with you and everyone from the Digital Etera Collective. So that had a lot of user research. But for the original COVID POC and the sandpits, the user research or even user testing hasn't been part of the scope, but definitely it's something that needs to be included once it's in production and once it's more a production version of the rules. The only thing that we can say is anecdotally, we've had people who have done one client in particular I can think of has done a lot of user research over the years with their citizens that they interact with, and they kind of said, oh wow, our citizens are going to love this, or our clients are going to love this. But that's more anecdotal, of course. It's not hard, cold hard facts.
Having a real story from a real user with a real use case, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
and the clarification of this point, and yeah, I got it like that because of rules of code. That's what sells it. Of the day.
Yeah. True.
Well, what an exciting evening. Has anybody got any final questions for Phillipa or Con or Jaden, actually? No? Well,
I've got another question for Phillipa. I wanted to ask, let's not talk about AI. Let's say other than AI, what's next in rules as code, and what do you guys see is the next extension of it? And look, I'm just a bit sick of AI. I've been going on about AI all day. So
I was going to say, Jaden, how can you say except for AI? I mean,
well, I thought it'd be an interesting caveat.
I guess an OpenFisca hosting platform is probably next for. For rules as code. I don't know. I'm going to have a think about that one, because to be honest, I like a lot of people in the space have been so focused on what AI can do.
Yeah.
I haven't really been thinking much about what other tools we could potentially use, because I don't know. At the moment, I feel like AI is where the money's at. So
yeah, that's true. With our other project, we've been talking about AI, and it's sometimes I feel like it's an AI hammer and an AI nail, and well, that analogy. I was thinking if there's any other possibilities with rules as code other than AI, but sorry, yeah, Con, you go.
Well, a couple of things. AI as using the rules engine as the guardrails for AI. So for AI not to be deterministic, but to be basically a UI for a rules engine that determines the outcomes and the questions. So that's one thing. But the other thing more broadly is, and this comment's been made internally here, has been that, the biggest blocker from what we understand, and, there are people in the room here, especially Jason, that have cut their teeth on this for many, many years and have a lot of war stories. But from what we understand, the biggest blocker to the adoption of rules as code is that effort that Phillipa talked about in getting existing legislation encoded in rule statements and in code. and that process involving subject matter experts and developers or business analysts, etc., is very expensive and labour and cumbersome. And while, and I've heard this from OpenFisca community as well, leaders, that, you know, while when you show rules as code and you demonstrate the use case and the value, everyone says it's a no-brainer. But why hasn't it been taken up by government? And I think, other than obviously Australian government putting the money behind it and really promoting it, but I think the thing that is different now that may help rules as code gain more traction is AI, in the sense of using AI to help that process of translating written laws into structured code. And I'm not talking about, you know, getting 1-for-1 and 100% accurate. It's about, even if it could do 40% of the job better, and then you had to manually update those rules, that structured rules statement, you know, from there on, it's still 40% less time than it would otherwise be. So I think the AI is potentially the thing that could help open the way for rules as code to gain greater adoption. And that's a space we're looking at, you know, as a
there's a lot of work in AI around the world happening. But so you cheated, Con, because you gave 2 AI examples. Jaden said besides AI.
No, well, this is kind of like, I'm happy to get into AI because what Con was talking about is actually, I'll just paste it in here. I was reading an article. I think this is 5 days old, actually. It's a very new article on rules as code. And they're talking, it's very much about a similar project that I did with large language models. It's about that, you know, it's bridging that gap between pure legislation and then the business rules aspect of it. So no, I agree. I think that AI is where it's at, but I wanted to twist it around to see if there was anything else. But no, there's not much else other than AI in terms of what's next with rules as code.
Well,
I don't know.
There's other things.
Yeah, I was going to say. Oh, sorry.
No,
You, Joe. You go, Joe. You go, Joe.
No. You go first.
I just suddenly thought of standards. You know, that's something that we have talked about as well before, in creating some universal standards. So, yeah, that's something that could be, or we might get AI to help us create the standards. So, sorry,
another
Joe, you
way
go.
that AI can pitch in to this process is that one of the things that's kind of slowed us down so far is tooling. It would be a lot easier to get subject matter experts more directly engaged in this process if we had better interfaces for them to use than writing Python code in an IDE. And so one of the ways that it's just occurred to me in the last couple of months that this is going to change is that when people want an application for something, it's getting to the point where they just go to Claude 3.7 and they say, hey, give me an app that does X. And then it writes the code and they end up with so I think the amount of effort involved in generating new user interfaces for things is dramatically falling because of the improvements in the AI. So, like, I started working on blocks 7 years ago, and it probably took me, 4 months of weekends before I had software that would do anything at all. And I think if I was to start over now with the AI tools, that might have been a day. Like, it's dramatically easier to do things like this now than it has been. So I think I'm optimistic that we're going to get kind of like more variety and more speed of iteration in terms of the tooling that's available, which can only help.
Yep.
And it's music to my ears as the citizen advocate in the room, which is the bit that I was gonna add. So, my answer to that question, Jaden, would be the pull from citizens for more transparency across government. Right? I was talking with Alfred earlier about a project that we proposed some time ago around a citizens ledger. Here is all my interactions with the government and the various different departments, right? The only way that you're going to do that is with an enormous amount of automation, cross jurisdictions, the whole thing, right? No. And as citizens go, I want more control over my data, over my interactions. Thank you very much indeed. There's going to be a pull to get automated at the back end. I think that's something that's going to start coming, particularly with everything that's happening around the world at the moment and the flux that's going on.
No, I agree. I think it's we have to break those silos down first, because it's even hard for us internally or going externally. Like it was just today, we were for my other project where we're looking at web kind of syndication. We were talking with another area in government, and we asked them if they could share some things, and they said, "Oh yeah, we can do that. We just have to get it cleared and all the things about open government, all that." But it's like, yeah, it's not easy even when you're in government to get those. Like, there's so much good user research being done, but it just can't be shared publicly. And there's a lot of things that just stay within departments, and I find that very sad. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got some advantages in New Zealand with our IDI and various other things that Stats NZ have been doing, but yeah, the same thing is across the world, right?
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah. Hey, this has been an awesome evening. We're 10 minutes over as always. It's never been 45 minutes. I don't think we've ever got it on 45 minutes, but it's been great. Lots of exciting news as well. It's been great to have both sides of Salsa and Salsa's client, Jayden, here as well. That's been great.
I'm not quite the client, but
you've got the inside track on what it was like from the other side. Thank you very much for coming along. For anybody that's watching this afterwards, we have another meeting, which will be, we're always the first Wednesday of the month. So that's the 2nd of April. Yes, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, 2nd of April, and it's the opposite time zone. So it's early morning rather than late night for me here in New Zealand, and and whatever time zone you're coming in from. But do join us, because every month we have some progression in this field as it starts to catch fire, and this is the place to be to really keep on top of what's happening. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming this evening or this morning, depending on where you are, and we will see you in a month's time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
Thanks, Phillipa.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye.